Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Robinson, or the Play Typer guy, as my kid calls me, and I'm joined again with Robin Panakia. And we had wanted to regroup to discuss a little bit more in depth. Robin had written this weekend, please don't call the cops on kids smoking pot in the park, okay? And I'll let you kind of, for those who haven't read the article, discuss the larger theme. But it just had stood out to me about what the police actually do and what a lot of Americans actually fundamentally understand that the police are doing and are happy with them serving that sort of role.
Yeah. Um, so on Friday night, I subscribed or follow a lot of Twitter accounts that report stuff that's on police scanners. Because it's actually, sometimes a good idea to good way to like be aware of a story before it's actually happening. And I saw this one that was like, a person called 911 to report that 15 teenagers were in Printers Row Park smoking pot. Um, and I was just immediately like, why? We know so much now about what police do. We know that for a fact that police have killed people for so much less than a joint. I mean, they killed, they kill over a loose cigarette. Um, that I don't know how someone could be like, oh, I'm going to call the cops on these kids because of this, victimless crime that is going on here. And, I think people have to be so much more aware of what it means and what is actually going to happen to people if you call the cops on them. Um, I think we were all very much, when we were kids, there was that, the friendly officer, Mick, whatever, would come in. That was just like the actual beginning of our guy's first name. I wasn't using it. I'm half Irish, but um, I just realized how that came across. Would come in and do the whole like, police are your friends. If you see something, say something. Um, and, that very much gets ingrained in people's heads. But, you know, there are a lot of consequences to saying something, and we have to be aware of what they are. And we have to be willing, I guess, to say, you know what, I'm just going to put this person's life at risk because kids are smoking pot and that's bad. So,
That's been an ongoing issue. People are annoyed with, I think, police being or rather people smoking pot and wanting the police to deal with that because you don't want to smell pot. But you were saying, like, if you call the police, you need to be willing to accept that they are probably going to, there's a chance that they will kill someone. So
yeah,
there's not, it's not like,
best case scenario, you're, making teenagers pay $100 to $200. That's in Illinois where weed is legal. I wouldn't personally think, oh, you know what, I really need these teenagers to pay this kind of fine for smoking pot. That will be great for society.
well, it's sort of police functioning as rich people's bouncers, right? So
Yeah.
I don't want I don't want to see poor people near me. Sort of like I want to live in a city of the equivalent of a gated community, and the police will
Mhm.
function as that, and they will function as bouncers, and they will function as, which is what they do effectively in that sense. They are sort of units of control by the wealthy or the well off, the property owners. Um, and when you mention that, I think what often happens is people then point out, but Robin, what if a rapist has you cornered and who are you going to call? And I mean, many of those situations, you're probably better off calling Ghostbusters
Yeah, like they're
than,
not coming to help you. It's not going to happen. 95% of the time, police do not arrive in time to stop the crime or even like arrest the perpetrator. Uh, for the most part, they don't actually prevent crime from happening, and people very much have this idea that they do, which is just very ass backwards and just not reflective of reality. I think one of my favorite comments that I got once on one of my things, one of my articles, was someone patiently explaining to me that uh, they showed me a crime that a juvenile had committed, and they were like, see, as long as there are crimes like this, people are going to want the police there to protect them from those crimes. And I'm like, but that crime happened. The
Mhm.
crime happened, and the police like didn't. No one defunded them. They existed. The crime still happened. So unless you're just like the police need to exist to lock every single human person up, it's perhaps better to rethink some things.
There was an article in the Bulwark, an interview with a new prosecutor in San Francisco, and how she was going to be, overtly pushing back against that, the crazy progressives who don't want, no, no, but these people in bad neighborhood, tough neighborhoods, they need the police, and I feel like there's a lot of the um spin, really propaganda, really, that I think that does target and prey on well-meaning people who would be like, "Oh,
Hmm.
right, yeah, like, you need the cops for these neighborhoods because there's crime. I mean, there's crime, and there's probably someone more likely to break into their homes or whatever." But that doesn't actually happen. It's sort of Richard Pryor used to joke about that. Like, if you need to get cops in the ghetto, you'd have to call and say, like, to actually help break a crime, you'd have to call and say that there's a bunch of black people beating up a white lady, because otherwise they're not going to care about what's happening. What they generally do in those neighborhoods is control. It's
Hmm.
an occupied force. No one feels safer. So no matter how many examples of, as you had alluded to, Eric Garner, the little cigarettes, there was Tyree Nichols, like, they're not actually saving. These officers aren't like Batman going
No.
for the neighbor savings. They're just literally you know, tormenting people, young people of color, looking for ways to lock them up, so accelerating the prison pipeline. But it's not like they are dramatically
I mean,
reducing.
there have been studies done, I have to bring them up, about how, police are, so much slower to respond to 911 calls in those areas, even like fire departments. Um, like, so they're not really doing anything to protect anyone. And, a lot of people, like you said, will insist, like, the people who live there absolutely do want more money for the cops, and they want more cops in their neighborhood. And I'm like, okay.
Well, yeah, it's a sort of, I if if a school was like, most of them were beating up kids actively, I'd be
Yeah.
like, okay, well, we need to sort of close the school, figure out what's going on. That doesn't mean I'm
Yeah.
anti-education. I think education's important, but, like, no, 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 you kids keep dying. Like, every time they go
Yeah.
to the principal's office, they've got a bear in there and he's eating them. This is like, not just, why don't you, can we get rid of the bear? Can we defund the bear?
Yeah.
No, you don't
No, the
support.
bear's there for a reason. What
Yeah.
reason? We can't tell you.
We
We
don't.
want bear reform.
It's like, we want bear reform. We can get a nicer bear. I don't know. I think the bear is gonna still be
We'll
a
be like
problem.
one of the dancing bears.
Exactly, like,
Um,
and they always, it becomes, and you've commented on this false choice of, oh, you either want you either have to have things continuing as they are, which is not particularly very good, or literally crime raging for the streets or whatever.
yeah.
You don't support, and that's
I
not the
mean,
argument.
clearly, it seems obvious to me that we need to reimagine public safety, because there are other ways to do this. And the way that we're doing it does not actually work out. You brought up rapists. Only 6% of rapists ever see a day in jail. Like, and that is probably higher than the actual statistics, because most rapes aren't reported. um, and I know a lot of people who have reported their rapes to the police, and A, regretted doing so, and B, retracted them because they were so tortured by the police for doing that. And they're rarely easily prosecuted, which, the thing is, they are difficult to prosecute. It is difficult to prosecute that the way that we have things set up. And we're not actually stopping the rapists. That's not happening. Um, and, we're not actually doing all these things that we think we're doing. And, studies show that when people go to prison, they come out worse. They do more violent crimes.
Hmm.
It we put people in, a place where they are also likely to be sexually assaulted, which is another thing I think people should consider when they report crimes. Um, they are also, they're likely to be, to learn other ways of doing crime and become more violent in order to like defend themselves. Um, we're not putting people into prison and having them come out better. That is not happening. So
Hmm.
that is not a good thing for public safety either. If that's our actual goal and it's not just like, hey, let's punish some people for entertainment.
Well, and a lot of mainstream liberals have sort of embraced the police unions and the right wing propaganda
Yeah.
rhetoric that anyone calling for reform, most of the, even as extreme as police abolitionists, they're all sort of goofy, entitled limousine liberals who don't know what real crime is, right? They live in these fancy neighborhoods. They have the luxury of not needing the police on that line,
Mhm.
to borrow from Jack Nicholson, to help them. And so they are, but if they were listening to the Latino and Black populations who so desperately need help in those communities, and it's to me somewhat repulsive because the people in those communities, or what they say, yeah, we need help, but it's not going to be from the modern police mold. And every effort for when everyone talks about reform, when you present those methods of reform, the police always say, oh, that's no better than defunding us, or that's no better than getting rid of us altogether, because it only we will only support this. We will only support the current militarization, tormenting these neighborhoods. We won't actually treat them. I think it was Alexandra Ocasio Cortez who said, when I was like, well, what kind of policing do you want in these neighborhoods? It's like, well, the same as in the suburbs, right? Like, why can't no one in well-off neighborhoods, or predominantly white neighborhoods, because there are white neighborhoods that are not particularly very wealthy that don't
Yeah.
experience this as well. They wouldn't endure this sort of occupation that these POC neighborhoods experience. And it's still, no one can kind of, oh, we just can't fix this. We can't do it. One big thing they love to do is to say, oh, well, this politician who wants police reform has their own private security. It came up with Cori Bush, and it's like, well, she needs private security from, you know active racists who want to kill her. Also, her own security, they're far more accountable
They're
because
also
like
doing something to actually protect her, whereas police, not
Pol
so
police
much.
would not. The police did they did the mob thing for, the mob protection racket for Beyonce, right? Like, during one of the past, they refused to,
Yeah.
protect one of her shows because she had films, I guess, they viewed anti-police music video. So that's kind of what you're dealing with the police. So where she could just hire some people to, like, literally protect her. Second Amendment, right? Here's my security
Mhm.
force. Also, the security people don't have qualified immunity. So with
Yeah.
Beyonce security, like, oh, there's someone aiming at Beyonce, I'm gonna go shoot a bunch. Like, if they behaved badly, Beyonce's gonna be paying out of pocket for that, as opposed to literally like, oh yeah, we really effed up. Qualified immunity is what the cops sort of kind of lean into now. So, um, in Los Angeles, where the police budget is uh 1.9 billion, there's a city councilman, Hugo Soto Martinez, who identifies openly as a police abolitionist. And the LA Times writes, while some take the term to mean a wholesale eradication of all law enforcement, Soto Martinez's stance that the city council should reallocate large chunks of the LAPD's $1.9 billion budget toward preventative measures instead of officers And all the very smart people will say that using the terms police abolition and defund is scary, so she come up with a different method. But preventative measures is not actually good because you what about the bad criminals and whatever. So what is like, I'd be fine if, like, okay, if you would say reimagine the police, but okay, this is what we mean. But in your comments to your own articles, people will say that and then immediately roll back to wanting to just keep the cops doing whatever they're doing. So what they're trying to say is they just want a superficial term. They don't actually want to, because I'd be the first. It's like, okay, we're just gonna here's my blowjobs for cops policy. If that will work, if that will fix, I'm all for that. Yeah, we're just gonna I'm all for that if that will actually get, but that's not what they want to do. They want to, because they understand, cops understand what actual reform and change would look like, and they inevitably push back. And um, uh, Soto Martinez was the painted as a cop hater. The Los Angeles Police Protective League spent about $32,000 in campaign mailers during the last primary, blasting him as a danger to LA's safety just because he believes they should use preventative measures instead of officers. So it's just like, if the fire department's union was going after, spending a lot of money going after politicians who are just like, well, maybe you shouldn't, like, let the fire blaze in your home when you go away for the
Yeah.
weekend, or maybe don't leave your oven on. No, no, none of that. You're going to put us out of business. And so they are actively, against any, and politicians get this, right? Like, the only way that you're going to get elected in some cases is to bend over to the cops, and it's the degree to which you bend over. But the debate is over how much you love cops.
Yeah.
And reform is usually like, how can we reform Robin? It's like, okay, well, can we give her more money? Or no, why don't we give her prettier clothes? I'm going to give her more money, and that's the debate, but not over
Yeah.
any other actual substantive change to anything you're doing. So, so I don't know what is your sense on how
I mean, we're giving them all this money, and most of what they're spending it on is traffic stops. Like,
don't they make a lot
uh,
of money from traffic spots?
yes, they do. It's like this weird, like, self-perpetuating thing where a lot of communities are very reliant on traffic tickets. That's, I think, part of why a lot of communities were very resistant to having like Uber and Lyft, because it was less likely that they were going to be able to pull people over for DUIs, pull people over for other traffic infractions. Um, and I think that that's why they didn't care that much about unionized taxi drivers in a lot of these communities. And in some cases, they didn't even have them. But they're spending most of the money on this. And then, they're also making money pulling people over and also killing people, pulling people over. And it's just this self-perpetuating cycle that it doesn't actually make anyone more safe. Like, there are other measures we could take to make traffic more safe. And we could look at that. We wouldn't need police officers as, doing as much of that. We wouldn't, there are a lot of things we don't really need the police to be doing that we have them doing that is not helpful and puts other people in danger. Um, you know, One of the general principles of anarcho-feminism is that our actual systems were created like by white men to benefit, or by white rich men to benefit rich white men. Like, that is, that's who created them, who invented them, and they set them up in a particular way so that they would do that. And then there's the idea is that a lot of those things need to be dismantled and rebuilt so that they are effective for everyone and not just the privileged. Um,
but recently we've seen that they've don't try to make the face of that white men. So,
Yeah.
because especially because white men now, they're all about weekend warriors, all their guns and weapons. So, so it's hard for them to be like, oh no, woe is me. I need the cops to come save me. It's like, no, no, someone breaks in, well, I'm going to give them both barrels. So what they do is they tend to make it about innocent white ladies who are
Yeah.
going to either be raped or someone's going to break into their homes. And in Los Angeles, I've spoken this with someone else, how it really was to me damning that someone like Gwyneth Paltrow and Katy
Oh
Perry
yeah.
were backing Rick Caruso because they were helping further that narrative of like, the black lady's not going to protect you.
Yeah.
This white man is. And
Well, I
even,
mean, white women have for a very long time been used. White women in the safety of white women has long been used to perpetuate white supremacy, and going back centuries, I think, at this point. Um, so much of so many of the policies that we've had that have been bad have been like, but we have to protect the white ladies from being raped or being, otherwise
oh yeah,
harmed.
but they certainly sort of are willing accomplices because they know that they are not going to be over policing in neighborhoods. It's not going to
Mhm.
harm
Yeah,
them, right? So it's not going to be. I often make the joke about the lady I saw was they were like walking around on a lawn with a glass of wine and like,
yeah,
hey, would you like a wine? It's like, well, it's not an open. As a black person,
yeah,
I'm like, this is not an open. This is not an open carry container. I can
container.
pull it
Yeah,
over, and but this obliviousness of like, you realize if you were, a black woman living in some of these over policed neighborhoods, you'd be dead. Like
yeah,
certain, and like the degree, the lack of freedom that these poor people have for no reason
yeah,
other than they're poor and black, of like, to the extent that some suburban white lady, you don't have to be uber wealthy. Just a suburban white lady does not realize the level of,
yeah,
oh, this is a law I've broken. I've literally jaywalked. Your child jaywalking, you don't think is going to, you just rush out and get your kid and yell at your kid. Like, oh no, you could have been hit by a car and this,
yeah.
blah, blah, blah. Here it's like cops will show up and have
Yeah.
arrested black
Well, I mean,
kids for shit.
that was literally the whole point of jaywalking laws to begin with.
Mhm.
Like particularly during the convict lease program era. It was basically, here's that and loitering laws. Here's a way to just like arrest black people for existing. Uh,
Mhm. Well, that was interesting you mentioned that because the 1619 project, still the people who really have this issue with it, they play this game where they will be like, "Oh, my issue, I want to ban it because it's shoddy scholarship. She sort of didn't dot this I on this page." When in reality, their issue is just that she says racism existed. Deep down, that's their
yeah,
issue, or that, and it was a founding issue in our society, and that, to your point, after slavery, so many of these towns came up with these absurd laws to create the perpetual underclass. Essentially, what replaced slave was convict, felon, and then
hmm
that tracks you for the rest of your life and is seen as a legal way to keep you a second class citizen. And so you do that as early as possible. So the 15-year-old kid is a criminal, and they're on this path for the rest of their lives. In many cases, even now, if you're a felon, you can't vote. And so that's sort of, and when Nicole Hannah Jones creates to say, literally, this is history, this is what happens,
hmm
and this is what was done, everyone was just like, oh no, she's racist, and creating like, that's all lies, America's wonderful, we would never do that. So the sense of policing being um inherently white supremacist is something that everyone pushes back on. And even with Tyre Nichols, it's like, well, they were black guys who did this to him. It's like, well, they're part of a racist system. I mean, the sense is to keep these people contained and controlled, and they're not trying to actually help. So even
yeah,
now, when marijuana is becoming legal in certain places, they still want to find ways to criminalize it and criminalize the
yeah,
use of people doing it. And no one wants to. Everyone looks at the stuff in a vacuum, right? So it's just like, when here's the people I call the cops on, and they
yeah,
won't say, well, are you calling the cops specifically on black people? And they don't want to examine that. And so that's like with the jaywalking laws, like, these are the people who get busted for jaywalking. These are the people who are more likely to get busted for going 2 miles over the speed limit in this neighborhood XYZ, and the police are enforcing these systems without ever being held accountable for how often it is discriminatory against a certain group of people.
Yeah. I mean, they have literally no accountability at all for the most part. And I always see these listicles where it's like, here's like 20 of the wackiest 911 calls. And like, we have very much perpetuated the like, oh, just call 911 for anything idea. And, if you're not, if you're like some white person living in the suburbs, you're not thinking like, oh, I'm actually going to, ruin this person's life over this, because that is what happens when we send people to prison. Like, yeah, there's the risk of people getting murdered, but there's also like a pretty big risk that you're going to ruin their entire life. They're probably not coming back from it. Especially like if it's a long stay. I don't think anyone needs to call the cops ever. I have never called the cops unless they are in like imminent danger, maybe, but the cops are probably not showing up for that anyway. Like they're not. They don't care. They're not
Yeah,
legally obligated to. That's another thing they are not actually obligated to do. So no, I would not call the cops for basically any reason
there was
at all.
an op-ed on the Oregonian, and someone had written about how some of the rising crime issues in Portland, Oregon, are obviously proof that police abolition and police defunding doesn't work. Neither of those two things have occurred in
Anyway,
Portland, Oregon. So it's just sort of
yeah,
it's the ultimate arguing of the straw man. And it's always weird of how, and this is all cities, so not just Portland, Oregon, but New York, whatever. So there's rising crime, often related to income inequality. Um, Actually, homelessness is clearly a systemic economic issue, but all these things are then claimed that it's the fault of any sort of quote unquote soft on soft on crime
oh, yeah.
prosecutors and so forth. And if we just gave the cops more money and let them do whatever they want to do, they would do a better job than what they're currently doing, which is not how any other job
Because
works.
the problem is we're holding them back. Like,
But I mean, yeah, I mean, so they've been able to their own issue, post issues in these towns that goes directly to pandemic shutdowns, which Republicans would normally be the first to say, here's all the problems that came out of the lockdowns. But here, conveniently, they list them as all just because people were saying mean things about cops after a cop murdered George Floyd. And
yeah,
I was one of the first when they started shutting down a certain down, during the lockdowns, like, oh yeah, this crime is going to increase. People don't have jobs, or these areas are quiet. This is all the recipes of this, and that sort
yeah,
of got seized upon at the same time to be like, oh, when you are mean to cops, now look at these shuttered downtowns and the rising crime rates. And so it's just very disingenuous. Um, so, and a lot of the stuff that people agree with, like um, not not locking up sex workers,
yeah.
not harassing sex workers, not harassing the homeless,
I mean,
not
they spend a
harassing drug users.
lot. Police spend a lot of time arresting sex workers. There are like 70 to 80,000 people being arrested every year for um, solicitation. That's not like the Johns or
Well,
anything.
yeah.
That's just the people um, not bothering anyone.
Well, there's a
May I
fundamental
say?
argument they make that this is all it is goes back to Giuliani's broken windows policing. Like
Yeah,
this, if you don't do this, then this is what creates your taxi driver in New York. And unfortunately, there's no one arguing on the other side of like these are systemic issues. There's no way to make it a I perhaps and you've I wouldn't say you're cynical, but you've been inclined to say they're not interested. A lot of Democrats aren't interested in making the argument that it's an economic systemic issue, that if you fix these issues, maybe even raise taxes or whatever, you could resolve them.
yeah,
Unfortunately, what happens is Portland has raised its taxes, for instance, and a lot of people are leaving. Wealthy or well-off people in Portland are leaving because it's like, oh well, they raised our taxes, and I see homeless people. And so this city's terrible. And so I don't know how to sort of fix that other than it's like, well, some of this is going to take time. And unfortunately, the quickest thing that has the the most immediate benefits is okay, here's all the money you want, cops, just go bust some
Yeah.
heads. And that does lead to superficial results, especially if you're not someone who's getting your head busted. And so I don't know.
Well,
What are
I
your
mean, so much of our criminal justice system is purely about catharsis. People like the idea of the police are going out there and doing like busting heads and cracking down on crime, and that feels good to them. It feels right because they watch these TV shows where people, the cops are like, oh my gosh, I'm hindered by the fact that I can't go and beat the crap out of this person. um I'm hindered by the laws that are, holding me back. And there would be, you would be so much more safe if, I could just, murder people instead of sending them through the criminal justice system. Because as we were talking about the other day, there are a lot of people, and, there is a certain contingent of feminists out there who are very much on, team no one should have a defense, like all defense lawyers are bad, like
uh
uh, the
thank you.
Nancy Grace.
uh, a friend of mine in New York went to the same church as Nancy Grace. Um, so I was only 1 degree away from Nancy Grace. Thank you, Robin, for coming back to test this. I think something we should continue on because
Yeah,
I
yeah.
hopefully that we can kind of continue pushing the fact that cops are not particularly helping. And if you want cops to do, if you want a system that is like not killing people but is actually stopping crimes, let's talk about building that system because that is not
Because
actually
this one is
out
not working
there. Thank you,
and
Robin.
it's hurting people. All right, see
Bye.
ya.